Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another episode review from the classic 90s television show, Are You Afraid of the Dark? This episode comes from season 4. It was written by Wendy Brotherland and directed by John Marie Comeau. I think that's how you say it. And it comes from season 4, The Tale of the Silent Servant. Now, The Tale of the Silent Servant, I've often heard been compared to Goosebumps' The Scarecrow Walks at Midnight. Both stories tend to fall into that Scarecrow sub-niche category in the children's horror space. And while almost every single kids' horror show I've come across has a Scarecrow-themed episode in some fashion, even Goosebumps has a few Scarecrow stories, this one, I think, is actually a pretty average Are You Afraid of the Dark tale with the subgenre. I remember when I first watched this years ago when I was doing a marathon of all the episodes on that infamous YouTube channel that I shared in the past where they had like all these episodes uploaded. And I thought this one was pretty good for what it was. And coming back to it, I still think it's a good episode, but really nothing all that special. And I'm sorry to the fans of this episode out there that might really enjoy this or think this is one of the top tier Are You Afraid of the Dark episodes or anything. It was just fine for me for the most part. It does have its charm and some scary aspects to it. But other than that, it is what it is. If you haven't seen Are You Afraid of the Dark before, or maybe you haven't watched the show in a while, The Tale of the Silent Servant is definitely one to come back to around the fall time of year. It just has that ambiance to it. Maybe not as grand as something like the Scarecrow Walks at Midnight episode from Goosebumps, but it does offer something to that effect, okay? So let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So like all Are You Afraid of the Dark episodes, it starts off with the Midnight Society gathering around a campfire in the middle of the woods, and they pass off to the next person each episode of who is in charge of saying the story. And in this one, the story starts off with the girl, saying, introducing it and giving kind of a background of the characters, and pretty much leaves it at that. So the main character, I want to say his name is Jared, and he has a cousin. I forget her name, so I'm not even going to try to remember that. But this kid named Jared, he's like 13. He's out visiting his relatives who own this farmland, and there's a legend about it that goes back a few generations, 20 years prior, where in the beginning of the episode, we see this flashback of this guy named Crazy George laying out in the middle of this farmhouse, kind of passed out, drunk, maybe delusional, I don't know. And this the farm guy comes in and wakes him up, and the guy's like spitting out nonsense that the spell hasn't worked and the talisman, will be his one day, whatnot. And the farm guy chases him out, takes the talisman, and tosses it into a room inside of the barn with a door that's kind of shaking, and he commands it to stop moving and stop, making any noise, and throws the talisman in there. And he says that he's going to go off and take care of this farmhand. And then it skips 20 years into the future where, Jared, he's out there visiting for the summer with his cousins, and they're out playing baseball. And he's throwing the ball to his cousin. I forget her name. I want to say her name is Anne, but that's probably wrong. And the ball breaks the window of the front door. And the kids are pretty much, scolded by the girl's dad and her older brother into having to work to repay off what just happened. So they're tasked with delivering some beans over to a nearby person because this farm grows beans. And they get sidetracked when they find this barn on the property, and they go look inside of it. And since Jared's interested in baseball, he wants to take some of this old wood that's not being used in there, and he wants to make a dugout out of it. But they open a door which drops this scarecrow inside of it. And they're like, oh, this is kind of cool. And the girl finds a talisman with like 2 dragons on top of it for some reason. Well, I don't know why there's dragons, but it is what it is. And she stuffs it inside of her coat. And they think it'll be a good idea to go hang up the scarecrow on the property to kind of, make it look cool. So they do that, and the older brother kind of scolds them and says, oh, where'd you get the scarecrow from? Did you get it from the person you're supposed to deliver beans to. And they are like, oh crap, we forgot to do that. So they head back into the barn. And Crazy George from the flashback is there. And we don't really know what happened to Crazy George. It's very ambiguous. But he's in there talking about where's the talisman. And he's talking about the silent servant and telling them that the silent servant's evil. And what they just uncovered are basically can't be trusted. And the kids kind of scoff at him, think he's kind of crazy. And he's doing some weird things. And the kids run off. And Crazy George is looking kind of maniacal a little bit. Well, later on, the kids kind of discover that this scarecrow that was found inside of the barn, they're kind of joking around calling it the silent servant. There's like they're messing around with the talisman that the girl picked up, and there's like a note inside, and they read the note, and they realize that the spell inside of the talisman must mean that they can kind of control this thing. And the boy character, Jared, he goes against Crazy George's advice because he's crazy, and he's like, well, maybe we can use it for our advantage. And sure enough, they realize after saying the spell that the scarecrow might have fixed the broken front door. And then they're tasked to like build a fence around this garden area. And Jared gets the bright idea to go up to the scarecrow and basically command it to build the fence for him. And then the fence gets built for them. The girl's older brother is kind of impressed with it all. But the girl's like, don't you remember what Crazy George said? There's like some consequence with using it. And the boy, says something that he probably shouldn't have said. And then what results is the fence gets broken down. And for some reason, the girl's older brother thinks that they, after supposedly building it all themselves, be willing to destroy it. So he grounds them. And Jared's really upset about being grounded. So he decides to command the servant to go after his stolen glove because he wants to play baseball while they're trapped inside of the house, being grounded and all. But he thinks that the girl's older brother took the glove. So they realize that the scarecrow is missing, and they must have sent the scarecrow to pretty much come after her older brother. So they race on their bikes to go to his softball game, and he's sitting there, and I don't know what they're drinking. They're drinking out of glass bottles. So I'm assuming it's soda because it's a family-friendly, show. But it could also be alcohol, and I'm not too sure about that. But anyways, they're all, after the game, chilling, around the cars, and the kids are like panicking, telling him, hey, where's the glove? And he's like, oh, I must have given you the wrong bag, because they realized that in the bag there was like some like spare tractor equipment in there. And they tell him like, oh, we got to get back to the farm quick. Something's wrong with the scarecrow. They realize that the gloves that, he commanded that the scarecrow retrieve was actually on the tractor that's being run by Jared's uncle and the girl's father. So they race back home, and they see that the scarecrow is about to do something to the girl's father. And they come up with a solution with the talisman to kind of break its curse. And they go to this graveyard, like this family plot that goes back generations. And they do something there with the talisman, which may or may not take care of the scarecrow with a spell and all that. And you kind of see the repercussions in the aftermath. It's one of those Are You Afraid of the Dark episodes that once the climax is over, pretty much the story's done, and there's no real cliche, corny ending, which I kind of appreciate. But then there's a twist involving a certain character coming out of the woodwork and kind of makes the story kind of all weird. But that's essentially what you'll get out of the segment of The Tale of the Silent Servant. And then the episode kind of wraps up with Are You Afraid of the Dark? Midnight Society characters blowing out the fire and going on the merry way. So that in a nutshell is what you're going to expect out of The Tale of the Silent Servant. All right, so I will say this for some positives. So I always like to start off with some positives. I think the acting in this episode was pretty well done. The guy who played Crazy George did a fantastic job at being just crazy, kooky, off the walls. And every time I've seen this episode, I can always appreciate him. A lot of people are probably, if you've ever seen, like I said, I keep bringing this up, and I don't like to compare Are You Afraid of the Dark episodes to some counterparts in other media. But if you look at Stanley from like the Scarecrow Walks at Midnight episode, they kind of serve the same effect here. Except Crazy George has a lot of ambiguity behind him, and I'll get into that in the negatives, but yeah, he was pretty well done in terms of his acting. Jared, and I want to say the girl's name is Anne, but I don't think that's her name. They're pretty good child actors for this show standards. They did a great job. The older brother of the girl, he looks so familiar, and I think he came from like a 1980s horror movie, and I can't remember which one. But he's in stuff that I've seen before. So it was good to see him and see some familiar faces. And honestly, I think the atmosphere was pretty good for this episode. It takes place on like some farmland, open fields and stuff. I think it's a little lower in budget looking than something like, Goosebumps attempted in Scarecrow Walks at Midnight, but it was still a serviceable location. And I really dig the backstory in the beginning. It was very odd and weird, and that kind of carried throughout the whole episode. There was just this off-putting thing. I could never put my finger on it involving the backstory and seeing Crazy George reappear in the plot. And there's something off that was very intriguing. It kept me hooked throughout the episode. And I will say this look at the Scarecrow. I know Goosebumps had a scary Scarecrow design in the show, but the Scarecrow here looks a lot more realistic and less cartoony. And it's kind of frightening. If I would have saw this as a kid, and I saw this Scarecrow chasing after kids like that, I would have been petrified. And trust me, this would have been something, if I knew this existed as a kid, I would have tried to figure out how to get a copy of it or something and bring it to my grandparents' house to watch it with them. Because they loved, watching, stories like, I think it was Pet Sematary and stuff with me. So, this would have been something that we would have had fun with, I feel. Yeah, and it kind of brings me back to thinking about family and visiting them for long periods of time. Because my grandparents, sometimes I'd stay with them for like a week or maybe 2 weeks. So, it brings back some older memories with that too. And I don't know, it's just, there's a lot of charm in the story as well. It feels like it's not going in too many tangents or anything. And the concept works as is. And something about having like a magical servant that you can command to do anything, but at the price of it taking it literally and going to treacherous routes if it needs to, is a good concept. But getting into the negatives, the first negative I have with this is the believability of the evil of the Scarecrow in the episode. The Scarecrow was propped up by Crazy George to be this evil entity, right, that you can't mess with, or, it's going to come back to bite you. And the only things that we ever see kind of backfire is when the Scarecrow destroys a fence. Or when the Scarecrow comes after the glove that was left on the tractor. It's still, how is this thing evil? And I get there's like a curse aspect to it, but what makes that evil? Right? And Crazy George tells these kids, which goes getting into my second negative, he warns them not to mess with it, even if it is. And Jared completely ignores it and goes for his own self-gratification out of it. And I just think that it makes the kids look kind of stupid. The girl character is not too bad, but Jared is kind of a moron. He's very much like a Greg Banks type of character, where he makes really dumb decisions to kind of trot the plot along. And yeah, Jared is not the smartest cookie in the batch, I would say. So yeah, the believability of the Scarecrow, the character decisions are kind of wonky. And then there's some unnecessary vagueness, which is getting into my third negative. With Crazy George, whatever his name is, this guy, he's in a flashback 20 years prior. The farm guy says he's going to go handle Crazy George, but we never see what happens to him off on screen. It happens off screen. Is this old former farmhand still lingering around the farm? Is he dead? Is his ghost haunting it? What's going on with that? It's never explained whatsoever. And the ending involving, maybe his character in some way, recontextualizes the whole thing, and it just kind of takes away from, the things we were feeling beforehand. It's like, this is what he was getting at. And yeah, it's whatever to me. So, yeah, the unnecessary vagueness with that, right? And then, there's some character logic issues, which is my fourth and final one, especially dealing with, like, the girl's older brother, right? This is literally how the climax happens. He goes outside and sees that this fence has been destroyed. After he previously praised his younger sister and his cousin Jared for doing such a good job on it, and it's putting all this time into it, he immediately thinks that it's their fault for it getting destroyed and blames them. And when the kids say, hey, it was the Scarecrow, he grounds them. Which makes no sense to me, because if you truly think that kids would go out of their way to build a fence of that caliber and, put all that ornateness to it, why do you think they would go out of their way to destroy it? It's like they're trying to get themselves in trouble at that point. Why do you think that is the case? The kids never really came off that way, right? And if I'm being honest, y'all, the places it goes to in the story, like, where the girl, right, I guess this can be a mild negative. She reads, the talisman has a spell with it, and the guy kind of chants it, and she kind of files it in the back of her brain. She pulls an Eddie from A Night in Terror Tower and pretty much outclasses the guy that's been rehearsing the spell for whatever. And they come to a conclusion that, the farmhand never came to, which, involves the talisman and how to, the whole concept of the talisman is you got to break the connection between both of the dragons in the middle of it. And while that's kind of a cool idea, right? The way it's handled is just kind of loose. But I guess it works, But yeah, it's some weird logical, plot convenience stuff going on. Typical for the Are You Afraid of the Dark and Goosebumps and even Haunting Hour shows, unfortunately, from time to time. But all in all, The Tale of the Silent Servant, I wish it was better. I wish there was more there. And I think for me, it comes down to the Scarecrow, and it comes down to what was utilized there. I dig the concept, but the execution, there was just no believability. Minus the Scarecrow actually being scary itself and looking scary, there's no believability that this thing is cursed or that this thing is truly evil. And like I said, the kids just make really poor decisions despite, sound advice. Even though the guy is called Crazy George, there is some sense of disbelief you can actually, have with that. But nonetheless, a lot of forced things kind of add up here. And if it was a little better executed on some things, I would be willing to give this a B. But honestly, I found myself thinking that this is just an average episode. A little bit better than some that I've seen in this similar category, though. So I knew I was going to give it at least a 3.5 out of 5. So where I settled with all the problems, I only deducted 1.2 off the top, and I gave this about a 3.8 out of 5 stars, which I think I'm being plenty fair on and generous. If you ask me, I think that if we're comparing this to like Goosebumps, I think Goosebumps has a better Scarecrow story. Actually, I think 2 better Scarecrow stories, and Haunting Hour, I think, has the best one than Are You Afraid of the Dark here. But I know a lot of people who love this episode, and if you're one of the people that love it for how crazy and just unorthodox the plot is, I can kind of understand that, because I really appreciate that about it as well. But it just didn't go beyond just showing that stuff. It didn't execute it where it counted, in my opinion. So yeah, that's just my thoughts on The Tale of the Silent Servant. Let me know if you've seen this episode down in the comment section. Do you love this episode? Do you hate it? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.